All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, we're only a few days into this new era of American politics, and Crystal and I can say something with relative certainty. It's pretty damn boring. Trump has disappeared from the public stage for 8 days. It was the longest period of his presidency, and I gotta say, as somebody who's had the news cycle injected into my veins for 4 years, it's very disorienting. But the one plus side of this so-called slowdown in news is it allows time for some reflection into the subsurface, rapid shifting trends in America today that will change the future of our politics for some time to come. I sat back over the weekend to digest exactly one of these initial reactions to this election by progressive data analyst David Shor, somebody who, despite my political differences with, I believe has very profound insights into the state of the electorate. And I wanted to share portions of that interview with all of you. Chief among them is something that we have been saying here since the election happened. This election result is perhaps one of the greatest indictments yet of the identity politics and demographics is destiny thesis that we've ever seen. Shor describes two basic things that happened in 2020 to produce the result, quote, college-educated white people in relative terms swung towards Democrats by a lot, and non-college-educated white people swung in relative terms against us. More so, Shor adds that education polarization ended up being larger than it was in 2016, and finally, that Hispanic voters swung against Democrats by large margins, the total extent to which is unclear. Most importantly, though, for our story, Shor describes how the pull of college-educated whites into the Democratic coalition could itself turn into a spiraling magnet that repels many working-class voters and minorities that they could traditionally rely upon, saying, quote, given the fact that college-educated whites donate at disproportionate rates and volunteer at disproportionate rates, I think it's going to be very hard for Democrats to resist the pull of catering to their preferences, which is naturally going to lead to losing votes amongst people who are not them. Furthermore, the drain of college-educated whites into the Democratic Party has profound class implications. While college education is not necessarily 100% correlated with income, in the aggregate, it's a reasonable approximation for how the richest people in the country as a bloc generally think. Lo and behold, a new analysis from the Washington Post is backing this up. While Trump's message on the campaign trail was targeted at upwardly mobile people, new data actually shows that those upwardly mobile people were exactly the ones who voted against him. Biden won 477 counties that account for 70% of the entire U.S. economy. As Heather Long of the Washington Post points out, Gore won 666 counties, which accounted for just 55% of the economy. That's profound because it shows a couple of things, that the number of counties which account for more of the economy are shrinking and urbanizing, and that those exact counties are all trending Democratic overwhelmingly. On the contrary, the Post notes that, quote, President Trump garnered his highest vote shares in counties that had some of the most sluggish job, population, and economic growth during his term. This again accounts for why exactly Biden overperformed in places like Georgia and Arizona. As David Shor says, it wasn't that black voters or Latino voters turned out for him in record numbers. In fact, it was college-educated whites of Maricopa County or those in Fulton County around Atlanta that saved Joe Biden and delivered him a razor-tight margin. The totality of the change that we saw on Election Day hasn't really sunk in, and there's a lot of incentive to read whatever you want into it. But on a policy level, there are already beginning things to manifest themselves in response to this coalition. Not amongst the centrists, but among the ascendant, quote-unquote, progressive wing that played ball with Joe Biden from the beginning. Of course, I'm talking about Elizabeth Warren. Warren, of course, will not be in the Biden cabinet despite playing ball. But I believe that she's going to play a big role in setting whatever trendy progressive things that Joe Biden is going to try and do in office via executive order or legislation. She released a list of such items. And guess what the very top one was? The idea of a quote-unquote massive economic stimulus. Yes, you read that right. The Warren plan for a massive economic stimulus is to cancel student debt. Now that's interesting, because another way to look at that is as a bailout for all of the brand new voters that you've got into your coalition. As Max Guinness of the UBI Center put it, quote, it's incredible that Warren can now see how poorly Democrats fared with non-college educated voters and still make a transfer of wealth to college grads her top priority for the new administration. And the way that I know this is really starting to get mainstream is that it was also the very first thing that Chuck Schumer said that Biden should do literally the day after the election on November 3rd. Look, I'm not really against student debt cancellation, though instead of a government bailout, I think that the criminals in higher education should be the people to pay for it, given that the size of their endowment very neatly roughly equals student debt in America. But that's almost exactly the point, which is that this comes at a cost to no one. Instead, it's a financial giveaway to the most loyal and new parts of the Democratic coalition, and it perversely actually buys into the old GOP school of trickle-down economics, that these educated elites would then spend their savings at businesses and boost the incomes of working-class Americans. And I think I have a better idea that most of you would agree with. How about we just give the working-class Americans money instead? And the point that I'm making here is about political will and emphasis. In the abstract, I'm 100% for getting rid of student debt. But the fact that it is literally the very top of the Dem agenda as a so-called progressive victory without making anybody cost, without reforming the education system, tells you everything you need to know about which policies are going to get traction from here on out and which aren't. As Adam Ozimek of Upwork actually remarked, quote, student debt forgiveness and getting rid of the SALT cap should help address the education polarization and prove Democrats are still a working class party. None of this is to say the GOP is going to do anything to fill this most obvious gap. But all of this is to say that the next 4 years aren't going to be a triumph for the people who most need help. And I think that that itself is a real tragedy. And this is something that it's hard for me to grapple with, this whole student debt cancellation, because obviously Heritage Foundation, everybody's like, oh, you can't do that, because of these, who will think of the poor debt collectors? And look, I think a lot about many of these college kids. I know so many people are loaded up with debt. But at the end of the day, $1 trillion wealth transfer to the richest, not necessarily richest, most upwardly mobile parts of our society, while letting working class Americans down, you can't do that. You just absolutely can't. And even in terms of forgiving student debt or canceling student debt, it has to come with a total reformation of the higher education system. This is just a bailout, right? This is just a total bailout. The higher eds they would love this more than anything else because people will take out even more debt to go to their universities, take out their degrees, they're barely worth anything, and it would just continue to financing this entire system. I just think it's such a misguided way in order to look at it, and on its face would actually just rip the country in half even more.
I kind of feel the same way you do, but I support student debt cancellation. Like, I think that there's been an unbelievable burden put on millennials, Zoomers in particular, coming out of college. But when you do that and you don't do anything else, and look, I'm sympathetic to the situation that Democrats find themselves in. It's not something you probably hear me say a lot, but coming into office with Mitch McConnell and Senate, look, basically all you're going to be able to do is executive action. And there is a really clear, I talked about this up last week, there's a really clear provision in the law that would allow you to do this. It's, the Trump administration forgave student debt of permanent and disabled veterans to their credit. So it has some precedent where you could do this without a lot of problem and it would likely survive a court challenge. So it's a really clear and sort of straightforward way to go big, which is part of why I think they've seized on it. But you don't see that same level of creativity applied to, okay, what can we do to make sure that we're getting money in the hands of the people who are really struggling the most, which is working class citizens, regardless of their race. I also think, there's been, and I've certainly engaged in this too, there's been a lot of tit for tat about this election result and who's to blame, and was it defund the police or was it the stupid centrists who don't stand for anything ever? I actually think in a way it's helpful to zoom out for this election. Everyone sort of seemed to forget that the Democratic Party brand has been destroyed in rural America across decades. Everyone forgot that the root of this problem extends so much longer back than this in particular election. Definitely predates AOC and the squad before anyone ever heard
Obama,
of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Under Obama, the Democratic Party lost close to 1,000 state house seats and massive legislatures that, flipped from Democrat to Republican. That's part of why the redistricting in 2010 was so absolutely devastating. This erosion in this shift was really overseen by President Obama. And so for all the talk, there's actually a really interesting interview with Alyssa Slotkin in Politico magazine. I don't know if you read this. And
I didn't read the whole thing.
She's a centrist. She's not ideologically aligned with me in a lot of ways. But I actually thought her insights were a lot better than what was coming out of Abigail Spanberger, who was it was just defund the police. Slotkin actually pointed to the fact, look, we've got this coastal elite leadership. Nancy Pelosi has been there and overseen a lot more of the decay and the decline of the Democratic Party among working class people and in rural America, certainly than AOC has. And there's never any reckoning for that. And that speaks to the fact that it's more, and this is part of what you're getting at, it becomes more of a cultural divide than even a policy divide. And when you have a Congress that's totally gridlocked, where there's not a lot that gets done, that cultural sense of like, well, which party actually is like, which one's my people? Like, where are my people? Who are they voting for? That becomes the whole thing rather than any actual policy outcomes. And that's what Democrats should be really fearful of.
This is the equivalent of Republicans being like, we're not going to bail out badly run Democrats. It's like, no, it's all America, right? Blue states and red states. Like, you can separate California's pension from the fact that California firefighters probably should not be getting fired in the middle of what the hell is going on right now, right? I think everybody would agree with that.
And
it's the same thing. So it's like you can't bail out your voters, and you can't bail out, and apply. It's like, since when do you believe in trickle-down economics, too? Like, now this is a massive economic stimulus? And as I saw pointed out, student debt forgiveness is actually technically liable to be taxed and would result in a 0% increase in GDP. These are so even the neoliberals who would support stuff like this are like, actually, under our tax code, it wouldn't even work out. So, again, I think that the way that we have to look at this is about matters of emphasis. And as the coalitions are changing, and you even see like Chuck Schumer trying to position himself so he doesn't get primaried by AOC or somebody else, what are the things that he's pointing to? This is his number one on his list. Same with Elizabeth Warren. I don't think it's a surprise that the person who represents the most college-educated state, and with all of these higher education institutions in Massachusetts, is pushing for student debt cancellation at the cost to nobody. And if you are of the 60% of Americans who didn't go to college, how are you going to feel seeing doctors and others get their largest debt load wiped out when you can't make your car note, and you can't pay your credit card bill, and you can't pay your rent, and you're hanging on by eviction? It's, I can't think of anything that would engender even more class warfare. I just think it's a terrible idea in the way that they're trying to do it.
I think you have a real point there. Because, again, it's one thing if you do something that's universal. It's another thing if you do something that only benefits one group where the others are all being left down. And like you said, I support the policy.
But it has to be something bigger.
But it has to be, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of ordering. And so I think those pieces really matter. The last thought that I had on this over the weekend is, there's a lot of question like, why did Biden lose ground with Latinos?
Yeah.
Why didn't African Americans turn out in the numbers that they hoped? Turnout was relatively flat. In some cities, President Trump actually improved his margin among African American voters, especially black men. And it really is pretty simple. The Biden campaign ran a campaign for affluent white suburbanites. That's who the whole pitch, soul of the nation, and that's who Kamala Harris was picked for. I'm going to talk more about that in my radar. Like, it was a campaign tailor-made for white suburban America, and that's who was excited about it. So in a way, it's a story of like, look, campaigns actually do matter. The messaging that you have and the candidate you put forward, and the way that but these things actually do matter. People are paying attention, and so the Biden campaign got exactly what they aimed for.
And it matters even more in terms of what policies actually get enacted whenever you get into office. And that's what we're already seeing right now. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.